So recently, there has been a lot of talk online around the potential for a particular 3DS game to make it to the Nintendo Switch due to what I would call something of a direct hint of this port project being possible. And in today's video, I want to go over the exact comments that were made and the game in reference from Mr. Sakurai himself and have a broader conversation on whether or not this would actually make a lot of business sense for Nintendo when it comes to focusing on things like the DS and 3DS library of games to potentially be brought and ported over to the Switch, and discuss whether or not we can ever expect Nintendo to deliver some of these classic titles to the Nintendo Switch in 2023 and beyond. What's up, Nation? If it's your first time on the channel, make sure you join Sunbro Nation by subscribing below. Hit the like button on this video if you enjoy it today, and make sure you turn on your bell notification icon so you're kept up to date with all the newest gaming news. Now, as I mentioned, guys, today we are tackling the topic and idea that has been floating around quite prevalently recently online due to Mr. Sakurai himself hinting at the potential for yet another classic 3DS port that could make it to the Nintendo Switch. And the game in question, of course, that Sakurai was referencing is none other than Kid Icarus Uprising, which to begin with, I think makes a lot of sense to throw it on the Switch because Kid Icarus is not a household name when you compare it to the other lineup of Nintendo IP that they own, like your Mario, Zelda, Animal Crossing, Pokemon, Donkey Kong, and even Metroid. It's not really a well-known and established character other than his heavy involvement in Smash Bros, and that's probably where many gamers today actually recognize the character Pit from, is just from playing him in Super Smash Bros. And just recently, Sakurai, I believe personally, was absolutely hinting for his intention to bring this game to the Switch, as he says the following: "It sure would be nice to play Kid Icarus Uprising on a home console. I wonder if someone out there will ever port it," and kind of smiles at the camera just a little bit, insinuating that yes, he would of course be the one behind that project. We know he's taking a break from the Smash series and the constant development that he has thrown into that, and maybe he wants to make something of a passion project of his to make one of the games that he was heavily involved with and really a lead mind behind that. Yeah, he wants to play it again on the Switch, and he wants to have it accessible via docked mode on a TV with a traditional home console experience. I think that this makes a ton of sense, not only for Kid Icarus Uprising, that will honestly have the best shot to sell that it ever has on something with 110 plus million units in the hands of consumers already, with no drastic slowdown. There are some missteps and some big numbers that aren't always being achieved now in the Switch's life cycle, but this thing by all accounts is continuing to sell incredibly well. And if you ever were going to test out a franchise and see if it could be brought back in the modern era, this is the platform that makes the most sense to do so. And where I really want to spend a little bit of time on this conversation is just that word, port to the Switch, because technically you do not really have to from the ground up remake these 3DS titles unless if they were heavily involved with the touchscreen control, and even then you may just be using some development tactics to make that touchscreen control compatible with things like motion on the Joy-Con, or just route it to that second analog stick. There are ways around a lot of the gameplay mechanics that were relied on the 3DS, and specifically, while I think the DS and 3DS have a ton of games that make all the sense in the world to port to the Switch, I also think that there is a conversation to be had around comments even from Mr. Miyamoto himself in the most recent Nintendo investors meeting, where he referenced that it is now easier than ever to bring back classic titles and make them playable on modern hardware because of development tactics being standardized somewhat in the industry now, with basically less hoops to jump through than they used to in order to bring back classic games or port them over. And again, that word port, it really could just be that for 3DS games. I am personally a fan of playing on TVs whenever possible, and while I love the handheld option, I always spend the vast majority of my personal gaming time gaming in front of a TV. That's how I've been my entire life. Most of the Game Boy titles that I grew up playing were through the Game Boy player on the GameCube, and that's how I experienced those classic titles. And one thing I've done with the 3DS library of games, because there's no option to actually play those on a TV, is of course the games that I own actually emulate them. And when you just upscale the resolution for these titles, they look absolutely fantastic. I would argue you don't have to do anything other then upscale the resolution and add in some anti-aliasing to kind of smooth around the edges, and they are all very playable and very enjoyable in a modern resolution on a PC. And I think that Nintendo could do that same strategy and maybe even do some things like HD textures and kind of reworking some of the texture packs and sell these games at $40 to $60 a pop. And it's actually not out of the realm of possibility, because we've already seen some of these games make it over to the Switch. We've had releases like Monster Hunter Generations, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team, and Miitopia all make it over to the Switch, and these are straight up 3DS ports. We even have one of Nintendo's upcoming 2023 games on their roadmap being a Wii port with Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe. And I think that as we approach that point in time in the Nintendo Switch's life cycle, where we know Nintendo will slowly start to shift some level of focus to what is next, whether that be a slightly more powerful revision of the current hardware, or whether that be the true next generation successor to the Switch, I think you pad the back half of the life cycle with a lot of classic ports and remasters, because those are easier projects to bring over, and it will give us some stopgap time for the developers to develop brand new Mario, Zelda, and Animal Crossings that will all be system sellers on the true next-gen platform, and we can enjoy more classic games along the line. Now, one other route that Nintendo could absolutely go with the classic catalog of DS and 3DS games would be just to throw them into a service like Nintendo Switch Online, which I definitely can see being possible, but also very tricky to pull off, because this would kind of create a scenario where Nintendo would essentially have to make a controller with a touchscreen in there, something like a Wii U gamepad, and that would actually be required to experience these games. And if you look at their history with how they stock their NSO controllers, they cannot keep these things in stock, and they typically launch them as exclusive through the My Nintendo Store online, or not even typically, they've always done it that way. They've never sold these things through traditional retailers, and that would create a big problem if they're adding on an experience to their subscription service and then marketing you a controller that you can only buy online through them to make the games playable, and you probably won't have stock of it readily available to go. If you look at their history, I think that creates a very subpar experience, and with how good these games actually look when up-resed, it just might make more sense to port them individually and sell them individually and have that big upgrade justifying your cost as the first time ever playable on a TV type of experience for these classic library of games. Now, when you talk about Game Boy and Game Boy Advance family of systems, clearly that makes all the sense in the world to go onto NSO, but I do think there is a second, deeper conversation to be had about how the DS games and 3DS games don't really line up near as well, unless if Nintendo does decide to go back to a dual screen formula or create some kind of controller with a screen for its next gen console, and that's when we could talk about these library of games being added in. That's absolutely a different route they could go, but you never know with Nintendo at the end of the day. However, I found this story honestly fascinating, and I love to see Sakurai hinting at future projects that he will most likely be taking on, and clearly we can't confirm that he's working on the port or that he has intentions to do so, but I definitely feel like this is more of a nod and a hint, yes, I am working on it, and I definitely think it opens that door for the conversation around all of the other classic 3D games that are locked on the DS and 3DS right now. I mean, games like A Link Between Worlds, Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, Metroid Samus Returns, a great remake of the Game Boy original, and then you have Animal Crossing New Leaf. There's a lot of different major sellers they have on these handheld consoles that I just think they should start to slowly port over and bring over on the Switch and see how they do. It's not a huge risk if the development cost isn't that high, and by all accounts it doesn't seem like it should be for most of the titles. But I want to hear from you guys at this point in the video, all your personal thoughts and theories around this. Do you think that Sakurai was indeed hinting that he will be porting over Kid Icarus Uprising to the Switch? Are you a fan of re-releases of titles, or would you just prefer for Nintendo to strictly stick to new game experiences, and you really feel like it's more of a waste for them to port over these classic titles? Or are you like me and you did love some of the games on the 3DS and you want to have the ability to play them on a TV directly through a Nintendo console without the emulation need? And which games would you personally say make the most sense to port over to the Switch in the modern era we are in today? And do you think we will ultimately see Nintendo lead into this strategy, especially in the back half of the Nintendo Switch's life cycle as we get ready to transition to what is next? So regardless of your thoughts and feelings on everything we talked about today, I do look forward to hearing from you all in the comments down below before you leave the video, as I do look forward to getting a back and forth conversation started with you all around this topic. Go watch yesterday's video next if you haven't already, which is on screen right now. Also make sure you like, subscribe, turn on your notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.